Last night we left off, we were talking about verse 21. And Donnie, are you making some adjustments? I don't know what it sounds like back there, but up here it sounds like kind of sounds awful, does it? Well, he's not talking about the amplification. He's talking about me. Sounds pretty good to you guys? Okay, well it's just me then. I'm getting reverb or something. I feel like I'm... Okay. Well, if you guys think it's okay, then I'm good. Verse 21. And we weren't going verse by verse. I don't mean to give you that impression, but that's where we were talking about putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness and humility. Receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. I want you to go back up to verse 18, because what am I always harping on in this class? Context, context, context. What's the context for verse 21? I think it goes back up to verse 18. It goes back farther than that, but we're going to pick it up at verse 18. I think that'll be sufficient. In the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by what? By the word of truth. Just like Peter said, the Apostle Peter said, we're born again by the word of God, by living seed. And so we are brought forth by the word of truth so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. This you know, my beloved brethren. In other words, you know that we were brought forth by God's word. That's what he says in verse 19. But everyone's got to be quick to hear. Quick to hear what? Quick to hear the word. Slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive what? The implanted word. Now, we understand the word. What's the concept of implanted? What does that mean? What thoughts does that conjure when you think of something implanted? It's embedded. Yes, it wasn't there before, but now it's there, and now it's embedded. Becomes a part of us, exactly. That's the way the word is supposed to function. It's not like here we are and over here's the word, and we're trying to accommodate the word or live according to the word. No, we bring that word, just like David said. We read it Sunday night. Thy word have I hid where? Psalm 119:11, in my heart. Thy word have I hidden in my heart that it may not sin. That's what James is talking about, getting the word implanted. We were brought forth by this word. It's what saved us. We heard it, we listened to it, we believed it, obeyed it, and it saved us. And now he's saying, keep this word. Put everything aside that's of this world, filthiness. I like the way the King James puts it, superfluity of naughtiness. The overflow of naughtiness. Naughtiness, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but naughtiness always escalates. You never get to a level of naughtiness and everybody goes, okay, that's enough naughtiness. Oh no. It's like being in a class of second graders when the teacher walks out. I keep coming back this idea in my mind, I guess because I experienced it when I was a kid. No second grader ever stands up and says, now listen guys, we're getting kind of rowdy here. We're getting kind of noisy. Okay, or there might be one prissy little girl that does that. But what's going to happen to her? She's going to get mobbed. She's going to get shut down, spit wads and everything else. Because second graders are going to escalate everything. And it's never going to come back. Okay, no eighth grader either. We'll just take it right on up the line. In this overflowing naughtiness, James says, get rid of that, cut that off, and receive how? With meekness. With meekness. I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but James has already talked about humility, and he will talk about humility more than once in this word. And when I talk about context, that's one of the things that I think we need to learn when we study, to pick up the context, is these reoccurring ideas. Sometimes it won't be the same word reoccurring. For example, look back at verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, What's he supposed to do? Let him ask of God. Now, what do you have to do to yourself before you go and ask somebody for something? Humility is built into that. You have to humble yourself to, okay, I'm going to humble myself and I'm going to ask God for this. Why do we ask God for anything, especially since we're Americans, if we can do it ourselves? I need to ask God for that. I can do that myself. And James is saying, if you lack wisdom, humble yourself and ask God. Humble yourself is not written into the text, but I think it's built into the text. Now, you can disagree with me on that if you want to, but I think it's there. Ask God. I think that same idea yes. And you can't supply it yourself. If you need it or you want it and you know you can't supply it yourself, you have to submit to somebody else to get it. In 1 Peter chapter 5, take a look at this. Starting in verse 5. You younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders. And all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. So that means this humility is enjoined on the young men. We see that it's obvious with the young men because they're supposed to submit themselves to the elders. You cannot submit to someone without humility unless it's the forced submission. But he's not saying elders force these young men to submit. He's saying to the young men, you submit yourselves to the elders. And then he says, let all of you be clothed with humility. In other words, when the young men submit themselves to the elders go, look at these wonderful, fine, spiritual young men. How can I help these guys? That's submission. That's humility in an eldership. And shepherds to say, I want to take care of these young men. I want to teach them and train them and bring them up. It's not the idea of, look at these little pimps submitting to me. Yeah, I'm going to use them. That's not the idea. It's a mutual kind of submission and humility. He goes on to say, for God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. The only way you can cast your care on God is to humble yourself to him. And this is what James is saying in chapter 1, verse 5, when he says, ask God if you lack wisdom. Humble yourself. Submit yourself. Ask him for this, and he will come through. He will give it to you. Once again, in verse 19 and 20, we see humility. Be quick to hear. Don't you assert your right to speak. And how many times have you been in a conversation with somebody and you realize, I just interrupted this guy because I thought what I had to say was so important to get in there. And you catch yourself doing that. And you realize, I need to back off a little bit. So James is saying, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, because your anger doesn't achieve the righteousness of God. Putting aside all filthiness, all this overflowing wickedness, in humility, receive the word implanted. Look at verse 26. If anyone thinks himself to be religious, what do you see in that? Do you see humility or do you see pride? I see pride. You think you're religious. Oh yeah, I'm religious. The Pharisees is sort of what I'm saying there. And yet does not bridle his tongue. What's a bridle for? It's really to bring a horse under submission. You're making that horse submit to your will. That's what the bridle is for. And so there's humility built into this. The word's not there in verse 26, but that's all about humility. If you think you're religious, but you don't bridle your tongue, you're deceiving your own heart. Your religion is vain. So you better bridle your tongue. All right. Yes. I think this is talking about your personal speech, your vocabulary, but not only your vocabulary, the topics that you're willing to talk about in the open, the verbiage you use, how you impress people with your speech. You know, you can think of people in your life, perhaps people you work with, that you've rubbed shoulders with. I was in the military for 6.5 years almost, so I knew people that they're just vulgar. Well, how do you know they're vulgar? Well, I've heard them talk. I know the things they talk about. I know the vocabulary that they use. They're vulgar. James is going to talk more about this, especially in chapter 3. But along these lines, I want you to, okay, let's look at the context again. Go back to verse 6. If you lack wisdom, what do? You ask God. You use your voice. You use your ability to speak. You ask God for wisdom. Look at verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted. So he's talking again about saying, talking, speaking. Ask God for wisdom, but don't say that you're tempted of God when you're tempted. Verse 19. Be slow to speak. And then again in verse 26. I don't know if you've noticed it before or not, but if you start looking for the times that James talks about speaking, it's a lot. In just these 5 chapters, he talks a lot about our speech. Sometimes it's the positive exhortation to speak positively, just like he does in verse 6. If you lack wisdom, ask God. Use your speech to do good. But don't let anybody say, when he's tempted, that you're tempted of God. And be quick to hear, slow to speak. And if you think you're religious, but you don't bridle your tongue, what kind of religion is that? It's vain religion. So you see on one hand the pure practicality of everything James is saying, the applicability. He's not talking in concepts and vague abstract ideas. He's talking very concretely about several things, about humility, about speech. And this is what makes us different from the world. He doesn't even have to come out and say, you need to be different from the world. Okay, well, I can be different from the world. I can paint myself purple and run around naked. And how many people do you know that do that? I don't know anybody that does that, so I'm different from the world. No, James says, just do this stuff. And if you do this without even thinking about it, you'll be different from the world. You'll be outstanding. Donnie, did I see your hand? All right. Don't hold back. He's purple. Just don't run around naked. All right. Now, verse 22. Put away the filthiness. Put away everything that's of this world. Receive the word implanted. But once you receive the word implanted, what are you supposed to do? Live it. Do it. Prove yourselves. How do you prove anything? If you had it's a bad example. I was going to say if you had a girlfriend. Most of us shouldn't have girlfriends. Yeah. You have a debt, and you want to prove yourself responsible for your debt. How are you going to do that? No, not co-signing for a debt. When there is a payment due, you have that payment there, and you have it there on time. And in so doing, you prove yourself responsible to keep a debt. This is how we get credit ratings. You either prove yourself responsible to have good credit, or you prove yourself irresponsible when it comes to credit. We prove it by what we do. And so James says, prove yourselves doers of the word, not merely hearers. Now, if you're just a hearer, what are you doing also, according to what he says here? You're deluding yourself. Now keep in mind, what did we just read in verse 26? More self-deception. That's another theme you see in James. Wow, self-deception, delusion. It's not that the world is deceiving us or the world is deluding us, the world is leading us astray. We're leading ourselves astray. I heard somebody say, and lead us not into temptation. I can do all right by myself. That's kind of the thing here. It's not the devil who deceives us. The devil does deceive us. But James is talking about self-deception in more than one area. And if we think we're religious, we know the law, but we don't do the law, we are deluding ourselves. If anyone's a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. Why do you look into a mirror? You want to see what you look like. What's the purpose, though, for seeing what you look like? Yeah, something needs to be fixed. That's why most of us go to mirrors. We look in the mirror because we're concerned about our appearance before others. And so we look in the mirror to say, okay, there's nothing hanging out of my nose, and my hair looks halfway decent. And okay, I'm reasonably fit to be out among people. I know that because I have looked at a mirror. Now, if you look into a mirror and there is something hanging out of your nose, I'm not trying to be gross or anything like that. I'm just saying, what would you think of somebody who sees that and then says, hey, man, I'm looking good. I'm going to go out and mix with people. What's everybody going to see? Something hanging out of that guy's nose. We look into the law of liberty, and Jesus says, be humble. We say, I don't want to be humble. And you go on your merry way. You got something hanging out of your nose. We look into the perfect law of liberty, and it says, love your brother. And we say, I don't want to love my brother. And you go out into the world, and people say, you got something hanging out of your nose. Because you claim to be a Christian, and you have no humility. You have no love. James is saying, if you look into the Word, you better do the Word and prove yourself a doer of the Word. When you look into the Word, it's like looking at a mirror and you're seeing a reflection of what you're supposed to look like. That's what the law does for us. That's what the Word of God does for us. But James talks about this guy, and he says once he's looked at himself and gone away, he immediately forgets what kind of person he was. One who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty. Wait a minute here. Law of liberty. I thought law was restrictive. How is this a law of liberty? Any observations? Okay. Yes. This is true. This is true. So many things, so many aspects of this are true. Keep your finger here in James 1 and go back to John chapter 8. And what we're looking at here in John chapter 8 is not the only aspect of liberty, of freedom. Verse 34, Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son does remain forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. What kind of freedom is he talking about? Verse 34. If you commit sin, you're the slave of sin. Jesus came to free us from our slavery to sin. He also frees us from the law. Right. When Jesus came, he delivered them from that, brought them into the church, the kingdom. into grace. And so James is talking about the perfect law of liberty, perfect law of freedom, freedom from our sin. We are free to do everything that's right. Nothing that's right is withheld from God's people. He designed us to do right. And when we live within His will, we find freedom to do that right. Verse 25, back to it. One who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be, what's he going to be? Blessed in what he does. Do you want to be blessed? I do some premarital counseling. And I get the couples in there. We go over Scripture. Sometimes they're not members of the church, either one of them. And so we go over Scripture. And one of the things we get down to is a budget. What do you think is the first thing in the budget that I put in there? God. I tell them, I don't know what you've learned growing up. I don't know what you've learned anywhere else. Here's what you need to do. You need to determine how much of your income you're going to give to God from the get-go. Don't wait until you've been married a few years and you got a little more income and you're a little more comfortable financially. Start now. Because, this right here, if you want God to bless you, you have to prove yourself a doer of the Word. It's not about money, it's about doing the Word. And when we're first getting married, one of our biggest issues is money. And how many ways and how many times has God promised us, if you have enough faith to take care of me, I'll take care of you. And how many testimonies have we heard from people who've been members of the church and they've sacrificially given and God's taken care of them? How many times in your own life have you seen this take place? You've given sacrificially and you thought, oh man, we're not going to make it. And you make it. Somehow you get by. God is saying, you want to make a good investment, here it is. You look into this perfect law of liberty and you do this perfect law of liberty, you're going to be blessed in what you do. And if you think you're religious, we're back to verse 26, but you don't bridle your tongue, it doesn't matter what else you do. This is kind of like 1 Corinthians 13. If I give my body to be burned, but I don't have love, what's it profit me? Nothing. You think you're religious, but you talk like that? Your religion is, what does vain mean? Worthless, empty, it's no good, it's pointless. If you say you're religious, you better act religious. You better prove yourself a doer of the Word. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this. And what is it? How long's the list? Pretty short. Visit orphans and widows in their distress and keep oneself unstained by the world. Is there any more to Christianity than that? What's James' point? Here's what I think his point is. When we humble ourselves to the point where we're not worried about our religion, we're just worried about visiting widows and orphans in their affliction and keeping ourselves unstained from the world. When we get to that point, everything else we need to be doing in Christianity is just going to fall into place. That's where you need to get to. And if you can't get to that point, you're going to struggle with everything else. But when you get to that point where you, and here we are again, where you humble yourself and say, I'm going to go visit widows and orphans. And I'm not going to go visit the rich widows. I'm going to go visit the widows and orphans in their affliction, in their distress, in their difficulties, and in their troubles, and in their trials. Because the rich widows don't need you. But the ones going through trouble do. The orphans need you. And in this day, I know we talk a lot about orphans these days, and a lot of kids, they're not technically orphans. They're just kids whose parents have abandoned them. Well, if you're a child, it really doesn't make much difference, does it? As a matter of fact, it's probably better psychologically to know my parents died than to know my parents abandoned me. So if we're talking about orphans, and somebody says, well, they're not really orphans, they got parents. Well, yeah, but what does the child need? This is how I believe God is trying to train us to think. It's not how can you find the best way around doing what you know you should be doing, what your conscience is compelling you to do. Not how can you slip through and find a loophole that maybe nobody else will see. Don't be a Pharisee. It's how can you humble yourself to the point where you're going to do what needs doing for people who need it done for them regardless. And when you get to that point, nobody's going to have to argue with you about coming to church or showing up for a Bible class, because it's going to be in your heart. You have put away from yourself everything that remains of naughtiness, the superfluity of naughtiness, everything that remains of filthiness, and you have received with meekness what? The implanted word. It's planted in you. You have received that. And then you looked into it like a man looking at a mirror. And when you looked into that word that's implanted in your heart, you didn't walk away and forget who you were. You walked away remembering, I'm a guy with a booger in his nose. I got to fix this. Make sense? I think it makes sense. I got to go find some widows and orphans to visit. I got to find somebody to minister to. I got to find somebody to serve. I got to humble myself. I got to watch out how I talk. Right. There won't always be a widow or an orphan handy, but you get the point. Oh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It does make you worry. Sure. Sure. Yeah, we should always be asking ourselves questions like that. Not because we're insecure about our faith or our salvation, but because we want to make sure we get the bases covered. Jason. What's Jason do every Sunday, Lloyd? He takes communion to the shut-in. How long does it take him? Yeah, he told me 3 or 4 hours sometimes. Yeah. None of us want Jason to be burdened with that, and he's serving. This is just one small area where we could step up to the plate and say, hey, let's come up with a schedule. We need to do this. We need to come up with a schedule and say, okay, I'll go see Lucille. How many of you know Lucille Laird? Anybody know Lucille or know of Lucille Laird? She's been a shut-in for years. Remember this congregation? She was coming at one time years ago, but then her health failed to the point where she couldn't come anymore. Judy Johnson. There's women that need somebody to bring communion to them, and we haven't necessarily gotten it done. Now, as I've told you this, probably a bunch of you are going, I could do that. I could do that. And at the same time, you might be thinking, oh, I don't want to get stuck with that. But being the Lord's church, I think we're pretty smart. We could come up with a way to cover these bases without anybody being overly burdened. And we're just talking about those of us that are here tonight. There are other men in this congregation that would probably step up to the plate if we just got this organized. That's just one thing we need to organize to ease Jason's burden and to take care of some situations that are right there in front of us. Harold, you had your hand up. Absolutely. I don't know how many times I've called somebody, and it's usually somebody I should have called a long time ago, but I call them, and they just keep expressing, I'm so glad you called. Thank you for calling. I really appreciate the fact that you called. Taking time out of your day. It's like, What have I done? I dialed a number. I talked to you for a little bit. But to other people, it's huge. It's huge just to have that contact, just to care, know somebody cares. Mm-hmm. It does. You like to know that you're important to people. And there's a way to prove to people that they're important to you. Just like James says, prove that you're a doer of the word. Don't just claim to be, but prove that you are. Any other observations or comments? Right.
Well, in the first century, Buddhists and orphans needed somebody to care because there was not a head of the house, a man providing for them. Normally, they didn't have anyone.
Mm-hmm. There weren't any social programs like we've got today.
Yeah. Besides, they were second-class citizens. By the civilization standard.
You're kidding me.
Very possible like that.
If you look at ourselves in a kind of selfish way, when we're sick or when we're not, we usually enjoy our family coming and saying, sticking their head in the bedroom door, so how do you feel? I feel miserable, I'm horrible. Okay, well, I'll get you a cup of tea or something. And that feels really good. But when it's somebody outside that realm, and these ladies don't have anybody in the somebody outside that realm comes in and offers those things, it means even more.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's when your peers or your adopted family that's taking this from you.
Let me throw something out here because I can't believe the bell just rang. When we think about this, I don't know about you, but you get this image of, well, you got to go find the widows and find the orphans, and the poor little waifs are out on the street in rags. And well, yeah, but what if it's Sunday morning and it's 9:30 and the Bible class is convening? Do you think there's anybody in that Bible class that's hurting? Do you think there's anybody in that Bible class that's struggling? Could you not, with just the sensory organs that you have, look around the room and make an assessment and say, oh, there's somebody that's going for surgery. I wonder if they're worried about that surgery. I wonder if they've got enough money to pay the deductible on their insurance. I wonder if they're afraid that they might die because they might. I was talking to Alan tonight, this afternoon. Alan Arnold. He just had this big neck surgery, and he said, when I went in there, I knew I might not come out. Well, yeah. Somebody else might be having trouble with their children. Maybe they're little children and they're struggling to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and they're brand new parents and they're not sure if what they're doing is right. Who knows? But just right here, we can look around and we can see there's somebody that needs some encouragement. It's that 2-minute rule that we've been talking about. What's the 2-minute rule for? That's so that we take care of people who need to be taken care of. Because it's so easy for me, I don't know about you, but I've got my favorite people to talk to. How about you? It's all right, Donnie. Got your back, brother. Because it's a pleasure for us to talk to some people. Other folks, it's not necessarily so much of a pleasure. Maybe not because they're bad people, but maybe we just don't know them so much. Or maybe because they are struggling, and I'm thinking, I don't want to talk to them because they're kind of a downer. They're going to talk about what's wrong with them and all their troubles and issues. I don't want to do that. She does. She's married to you. But that's an opportunity for us every single time we get together. What if every member of this congregation came in Sunday morning and said, I'm going to look for any visitors, because if somebody's visiting here, they might feel out of place, they might feel insecure, they might feel like they don't know if they're welcomed or not, or if they're wanted, or if they're appreciated. So I'm going to look for a visitor. What if every visitor that came in here was just overwhelmed because people were lined up to speak to them and greet them and tell them how glad they are to see them here? And I don't know you, but do you live in Choctaw? It's just such an easy thing to do. It's so effortless.
Continually talks about bearing one another's burdens.
Yes.
Whether they're member here, whether they're visitor here, whether they're widow or one from on the street, that's our job is just to bear one another. And that helps us bear our own.
Here's that good. Christian, every family in this congregation, not this time, that they problem.
Yeah.
Yes, but in it was serious for them. It may not be serious for us, but it is.
And how many times do we think, oh, they're doing great, they don't have any problems, they don't have any issues, and then all of a sudden it just kind of busts loose. Oh, I had no idea. Well, why don't we have some idea? Is it because we don't take time to go and meet people we haven't yet met, or get closer to people we haven't yet gotten close to? However, who doesn't know that Dave cares? See, that's the thing. Everybody knows you care, regardless of how you go about it. Everybody knows you care, because that's just your nature. And which part? Yeah. And as we read through James, there's so many ways we can look for these things to apply. And I don't know about you, but I read things like this, and I think, like I said about the orphans, well, the orphans are off somewhere. The widows are off somewhere. Maybe I'll make some time next week to go see a widow. Well, no. There are people who are hurting all around us all the time, almost. And we can do something about that. That's right. Because especially if it's somebody you don't really know, I'm not going to just, as we use the expression, pour my heart out or pour my guts out to you when I don't really know you that well. Well, we ought to know each other well enough that we could say, can you help me with this? I'm hurting. I don't need you to do anything. I just need to tell somebody about it. Maybe that's all some folks need. But the bottom line is that we have this humility that compels us to serve others. I think that's what James is talking about here. And I think he started talking about these kinds of things early in the first chapter, because he knew he was talking to people who were filled with pride and who would not react very positively to some of the things he had to say. Thank you, guys. I appreciate your attention. Lord willing, we'll come back to this next week, starting in chapter 2.